First of all, just thank you guys for coming. This is our third event for 2020 Vision. We are, just for a little bit of background for any newcomers, we are a group of young adults kind of encouraging and fostering conversation about mental health and wellness. We are the brainchild of One Lamb, which is backed by PRUMC, which is why we are here today. Really just trying to kind of get the conversation going, kind of better understand what it is about mental health and kind of our generation. And a lot of us, I think, here have been touched either very close and personally, or know someone who's been affected by tragedy related to mental health and wellness. So again, thank you guys so much for coming. And with that, today we have Doug Hurd. Actually, excuse me, before I go into that, if you could please just finish signing in. So Caroline had a QR code up at the front. Please just submit that form. We are trying to make sure that we have everyone's emails and names, so we can kind of push out the message to you guys for any events moving forward. Additionally, for the first time, we are debuting a QR code up front for Q&A. So we're very high-tech, 21st century. So if you have any questions that come in while Doug's speaking, you can submit through there. We'll kind of be collecting questions online, so then we can kind of ask Doug those questions at the end. So with that, Doug Hurd is the Assistant Director of Client and Community Engagement with Skyland Trail. So Skyland Trail is a nonprofit based here in Atlanta. Been here for about over 30 years. They are helping patients through mental health issues, and kind of what Doug primarily does is helps get those patients kind of back out into society and kind of helping them find work and things like that. So without further ado, welcome Doug with a warm applause here.
Thanks, Owen. Thanks, everyone. Well, I am excited to be here with you tonight. A little bit of a return to form for me, standing behind a pulpit on Sundays. Before I pivoted back to my first love of social work, I had a brief foray at Candler School of Theology, where I learned that I did not want to be a minister, and went back into social work, but that's what I was doing in my 20s. So career counseling for folks in their 20s is sort of near and dear to my heart for that very reason. So a little bit about Skyland Trail. As Owen said, we are a residential treatment facility for folks with mental illness here in Atlanta. I've been there about 7 years, and I run two programs there, one of which is our vocational services department, and the other is our transitional housing. And what they both have in common is sort of that they're aimed towards what's next. So after someone has left Skyland Trail's treatment, what are they going back to, whether that be work, school, volunteering, stuff like that. And also, how are they going back in terms of, are they ready for those requirements? Are they ready to live independently, manage their finances, make enough money to pay for their apartment, keep their apartment clean, all that sort of stuff. So it is a purely secular environment there at Skyland, and as I mentioned, I was at Candler for a little while, and one of the quotes I heard from there that I took with me, the two things that I learned while I was at Candler: one, the people that tell you not to date someone you meet in grad school who is also in grad school are right. They're just right. They sound like old people who are trying to ruin your fun, but they're right. So that's one thing I learned. And the other thing I learned was this quote from Frederick Buechner, who says, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." And so, even though I'm not necessarily bringing that quote as such into my sessions with folks, that's sort of what I'm always doing as I sit down and work with our clients. I'm looking for, where is this person going to be most glad, and where is there a slot where the world needs them to do that thing? And very often, I often say my job is simple, but it's not easy. It's very often hard to find that spot, but it's not really super complex. I really just have to talk to people until I see them light up, and then I've got to find a way to get them paid for that. Which can be very difficult, but it's not super confusing. So what I want to do tonight, to kind of back up and kind of give you that, I want to talk to you about sort of how I walk someone through that process of figuring out where it is that they may fit. A lot of that is very specific to the work I do with folks who have mental illness, and a lot of it is very general. Like if I sometimes do freelance stuff outside with people who don't have a particular diagnosis, and the process looks very much the same. So I want to bring in some of the specific roadblocks that folks with mental illness may run into in the job market. My hope is that for all of you who are still figuring that out for yourself, that something I say tonight will be helpful to you. And then for all of you who are looking to be supportive for other folks, particularly folks living with mental illness, as they figure out what this needs to look like for them, that it would be supportive for you in being able to talk to them about that. As Owen said, we will have questions here at the end, and also if you want to like throw up a hand or throw something at me or something like that, if you have a question earlier on, that is very okay. So, one of the questions that I get a lot when I do these sorts of things is, why do you have this job at Skyland Trail? Like, why do you have career counseling specifically there? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that there's a lot of data actually that folks who are living with mental illness will have a reduction in symptoms if they have improved engagement with whether it be their work or their school or volunteering, whatever it is that they're doing in their lives. That if they have improved engagement with that, they'll have a corresponding reduction in symptoms. So that's one of the specific reasons that I have that role there. And there's a lot of reasons we think that is. One of them is very, very logistical. One of the things that we know, most types of mental illness really benefit from an element of having structure and routine. So, for example, we know that depression, one of the things that people who are living with major depressive disorder often want to do is sleep all the time. The disease sort of makes one want to do that. And we also know that oversleeping can be really detrimental to someone's experience of that illness. And there's a lot of ways you could deal with that. One of the easiest is to have a job you have to get up for, right? Early on in my time at Skyland Trail, one of our clients that I got to know, actually he and I had the same first day. I was there as an employee and he was there as a patient on the first day. And we kind of got to know each other. We bonded over the shared love for this video game that had just come out. I don't even remember what one it was now. But he was saying, man, like, you must be so much more disciplined than me. I just stay up all night playing that video game. And I said, I am not more disciplined than you. I am not a better person than you. I just have a job that will yell at me if I don't show up for work on time, right? And so that's just like one very simple example of where the logistical stuff of that need for structure can come in. Another is need for human connection, which shouldn't be too strange to hear for people who gathered on a Sunday night inside a church, that humans need connection. We all need that, and particularly people with mental illness often have a very isolating experience of the world. And so even if your boss is a jerk, your boss is a person, and being around people is good for symptom reduction for mental illness. And so one of the things that we know is that by getting people sort of out and about and engaged, that's why we see that corresponding symptom reduction I mentioned earlier. Another thing, and I think this is bigger actually, I think those logistical things are there, I think they're part of the picture, and I think they matter. But I think what is bigger is the pain that people feel when they're alienated from their communities in a way that they feel that they can both give and receive, that they can contribute and be contributed to. I don't think that's specific either to people with mental illness. I do think it is amplified when someone's experiencing that. And so if we go back to that Buechner quote, that the place you're looking for is the place where your gladness and the world's need collide. I think the flip side of that, the sort of painful flip side of that, is that if you can't find that place, you are going to be less glad. You are going to have more suffering that you're experiencing during that time. Is anyone familiar with this process, whether you're in it right now or not? Is anyone familiar with the process of like looking for where you belong in the world and like what you're trying to do, and then it kind of sucking that you haven't found that yet? Is that like completely, I was the only one who had a career change in my 20s? Yeah, cool, okay. Right, and so imagine if you're like already dealing with depression and then you have that sandwiched on top of it, right? It gets to be a lot. And I also think that there's suffering in the world. So like if that place for you is being an accountant in Poughkeepsie, you are less glad because you're not there, but they are also less glad. There's a U-shaped hole in that community that they're kind of waiting on you to fill. And so that's part of what is really challenging about career counseling in a mental illness capacity. It's also something that's really joyful for me, is I know that if I'm helping someone, if I'm helping Bob find Bob's place, I'm also helping the community that is full of people I may never meet who are going to be blessed by having Bob in that slot. And so that's a lot of what I'm looking for with folks. So some things that I see getting in the way, what are some of the barriers that I end up working with folks as we try to cross over that. Oftentimes folks just don't know what it is that would make them glad. They don't know what it is that they would enjoy or that they would be good at. And that can happen for a lot of reasons. It can be that they didn't have the opportunity to pursue those sorts of things. It could be that they didn't have time. Some folks have just such significant experiences of trauma in their developmental years that sort of every day was surviving. There wasn't really this long thought given towards, those bigger questions of, who's familiar with Maslow's hierarchy? Anyone familiar with that? Owen. All right. Everyone should Google it. It's good stuff to know. But it's basically this like pyramid, right? And it kind of talks about the hierarchy of human needs. And at the bottom of the hierarchy are things like food, clothing, shelter, and safety, right? You get up to the top of the pyramid and it's stuff like self-actualization. And so the idea is that you really can't skip any of the steps. Like, you're not gonna have a great time trying to self-actualize if you don't have a safe place to sleep tonight, right? And so if that's been your whole life, you may not have had time to think about those sorts of things. Similarly, you may have been sort of locked out of those things. I've worked sometimes with folks who maybe have a couple of charges on their record that they picked up when they were in an active addiction process. And because of those charges, they're not able to pursue the particular career. They're sort of locked out of that career that they maybe had wanted to move towards. It can be lots of different reasons. And sometimes it's just as simple as not knowing what it is that's out there. I'm gonna keep moving. I will come back to some of what we can do about this. This section of the talk is gonna be very depressing. We're just gonna talk about everything that gets in the way, then we'll come back to some of what we can do about that. Sometimes the challenges are also very external. So sometimes folks may have a real sense of what they enjoy, but may be very, very locked out of that. Or they may have a way that they can do it, but they're only able to do it as a side gig because the particular thing they enjoy doesn't pay enough. And one of the things that we need to understand is the environment that we're in. The environment that we're in is not very friendly towards people. I'm gonna be generous to myself and say our age, but to people your age, the environment is not very friendly. Without going too far into like politics of things, one of the things with that is that we're in a capitalist system, and capitalism actually requires a degree of unemployment in order to function. And I'm talking about that because we're in Atlanta, Georgia, in America, and we're a capitalist country. If I were doing this talk in Belarus, I might talk about the challenges that socialism presents for career counseling, and there are challenges there too. But in our system, there are some challenges. And it can sound like a tinfoil hat thing to say that capitalism requires unemployment, but if you doubt that, you can Google economists from all across the political spectrum. They have different feelings about whether that's true or not, but they will all tell you that that is part of it. And so one of the weird things about my job is that I am a career counselor who is intimately connected to knowing the importance that successful engagement with work has for people living with mental illness. And I'm doing that in a system that needs a couple of those people to never find a job, right? It's a challenging thing, but it does lead to the fun thing of one of my patients called me an anti-capitalist career counselor, which is the coolest job description I think I've ever been given. Pardon me 1 second. Talking about capitalism in Georgia, it's always a risk. But again, other systems have other challenges, but that's one of the challenges that we have here. And typically, particularly when capitalism is selecting for who is going to go unemployed in order to make things function, typically it's going to select people who are already marginalized in some way. And that can look a lot of different ways. It can look like gender and sexual minorities, it can look like racial and ethnic minorities, and it can look like minorities in terms of people who live with mental illness. And so that's one of the things that every single person I'm working with, whether they consciously are aware that they're running into that or not, that's one of the things that they are running into. And so part of why I bring that here is that if you are in your 20s and you're trying to figure things out and you're feeling like you're just hitting a bunch of walls, know that that's part of what is happening, that there's stuff that you have and that you may need to work on. There's stuff outside of you that is a real challenge and needs to be handled strategically. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another sort of thing that has happened in the last couple of years to systems all across the spectrum in terms of how you organize your economy are industrialization and globalization. So a lot of jobs have been shipped overseas, a lot of jobs have been phased out. Right now you're probably seeing a bunch of stuff in the news about jobs being given to robots. That's why I went into social work, because Eventually, probably the robots will come for that, but it'll be a long time before people will pay money to talk to a robot in therapy, right? So I'm trying to just robot-proof my career. And so, you know, I think that one of the things that has shifted under our feet in the last 20 or so years has been that as the sort of available types of jobs have shrunk, and then people still need to be unemployed in order for the system to function as it's designed to function. And then people are marginalized in different ways. And by the way, being young is a marginalized thing. Oftentimes I think we get used to, or I remember when I was young and people older than me would be like, I wish I could be young again like you, it's so great. But in terms of the job market, being young is also a marginalized identity. Whatever else is going on, you have that going against you. Who's run into the thing where you're applying for an entry-level job and they're like, we need 2 to 5 years experience for an entry level? Yeah, okay, there's where the hands come up, yeah. Everyone's run into it. I mean, I remember early on in my career at Skyland, I was helping someone look for a job that was entry level. It was paying $12 an hour. And this was in 2017, you know? So, I mean, $12 an hour went further then than it does now, but was still only $12 an hour. Required a master's degree and 2 or 3 years of experience to make $12 an hour, right? And so it's just, it's maddening sometimes to kind of see that. And so that's something that you're also all dealing with. Again, whether you're conscious of it or not, there's some real age discrimination. And sometimes it shows up on interviews. It may even show up in ways you're never privy to, because if someone reads your resume and goes, they haven't been doing this for 10 years, not even gonna call them, right? So that's one of the other things that's going on. And so what you end up having is this sort of artificial scarcity around available jobs. And so you end up having a lot of competition in there in a way that can be really distressing. And again, if you're dealing with that while you're also dealing with a disorder that makes it very difficult to get along with people, or makes it very difficult to get out of bed in the morning, or makes it difficult to accurately figure out what is real versus what is a hallucination, if you're dealing with all of that, on top of that, you really have a lot of things stacked against you. So I want to actually pause there and see any questions so far. Any questions? Are we tracking? Okay, cool. And so with that, one of the things that we try to do, a big part of my job is I sort of think of it as de-gaslighting people, because I think that what very often we grow up with in this country is the sense that if you are willing to work hard, the red carpet will be rolled out for you, you'll have an incredible job, it will be awesome, and as long as you don't mess it up, you'll be a millionaire someday, right? And whether anyone like literally believes that, we sort of have that ethos kind of in the back of our minds often as we go through the world. And so when you're doing what I do, which is working with people who haven't figured out how to get the red carpet to roll out yet, very often there's this internal blame that they feel. And very often they get that blame from family or friends or the TV or whatever, but they also have this sense of internal blame. And so while there are sometimes things that people do need to work on, a big part of what I view my role as is sort of de-gaslighting people, like kind of saying, hey, it's actually not that way. Like that is the story we tell. That is actually not the world we live in. And so the fact that that hasn't happened for you doesn't make you bad. It doesn't mean this is all your fault. It actually is you running into these realities. And so that's where we try to have these honest conversations about what those realities are. At the same time, we do talk a lot at work about what skills someone can use. So I don't know if you've had, I think maybe one of the people that came earlier maybe talked some about DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. If not, I won't go into all of it, but it's a modality that we use at Skyland Trail for some of our tracks, and I really love it because it really talks about how to manage significant emotional distress and significant interpersonal conflict. And when I think about most of my clients' experiences of working, that's what I think about, like in emotional distress and interpersonal conflict. And so a lot of what I do is walk through with people how they can use those skills in the context of their jobs. So one of the things that we'll do is talk through, okay, if you're having conflict at your work, how are you gonna handle that? And so an example of that, I was working with a young woman recently who was really struggling in her job. Her boss was sort of constantly exasperated at her, and she said, okay, Doug, do you think I should tell her I have a mental illness? And I said, okay, well, maybe, let's talk through. And as we talked through it, what was really happening was that her boss was giving very unclear instructions. She was doing what people who are given unclear instructions do, which is obey unclearly and arrive at not the desired result. And so she thought, okay, if I tell my boss that I have a mental illness, maybe she'll like be more understanding and she'll be more patient with me, right? And what we talked about is that what was actually not happening there was that a symptom of her mental illness was keeping her from working. What was happening there was that her boss was providing ineffective direction, right? And so then we talked about, like, there's only so much you can do when you're a brand new employee working hourly to change how your boss approaches you, right? And there's some things you sort of have to live with, so how are we gonna live with this? And there could be an element of like, could you ask your boss for more specific direction? So we talked about, how do you ask your boss a clarifying question when they give you an instruction? But ultimately, we kind of moved through that way. She did get let go, actually, by that boss about 2 weeks after we had that conversation. And because we had done that work, we were able to sit there and kind of talk it through. And she was able to kind of say, okay, I think I know better what kind of style of boss I work with best and what one I don't, and I think I'm gonna be okay. So that's an example of what we're looking for all of our patients at Skyland Trail. It's also an example of how sort of the stigma around mental health often functions. And so if you're a person living with a mental illness, if you're seeking to support your friends who have mental illness, be mindful of that there is this sort of sense of stigma that shows up even there in the sense of like, well, maybe I'm a bad employee and maybe it's because I have mental illness, and so if I said I had mental illness, she'd understand why I'm a bad employee, when she wasn't even a bad employee, right? But that can be the loop that people get caught in. And so a big part of my job is to figure that out. The flip side of that is sometimes I have people saying, my boss is an idiot, and I told him that, and he's not dealing with that well, but I don't care. And I'm like, well, you know, I haven't met your boss. However, let's talk about what's gonna be effective and what's not gonna be effective, right? Let's talk about what's gonna work and what's not gonna work for your goals. And that is another thing that we spend a lot of time working on with people is short, mid, and long-term goals. So where do you want to be in 10 years? What does that mean for now? But also, okay, your boss is an idiot, you don't like your boss, you're ready to flip them off and run out the door. You can do that, that's one of the choices available to you. Also, you have rent coming due and you need a paycheck and your boss signs the checks. And so what choice do you want to make? You know, and is it time to work things out with your boss? Is it time to not say anything, but start looking for something else and kind of get ready to move into that? Is it time to flip your boss off and run out the door? I've never recommended that to someone, but we've always put it on the table as an option. Because I get it, I get that impulse sometimes. And so that's a big part of how I see mental health and the workplace sort of coming together, is that very often my clients are looking at themselves in this sort of stigmatized light, and so we're trying to de-gaslight and destigmatize that. The other side is that sometimes there is actual workplace discrimination that is happening. Who knows what it means when we say that Georgia is a right-to-work state? Does anybody know what that means? Okay, yeah. Do you want to take a stab at defining it?
I mean, you're essentially signing a contract and they can terminate you on essentially any terms they want to. Can't sue, right?
Pretty much, very close, very close. That's basically it. So basically, if I'm your boss, if I'm Owen's boss, I can fire Owen without a reason, and he could sue me. You can sue him, but he would very lose. He'd get laughed out of court, right? Now, there are some protected categories in the U.S. So like, I couldn't be like, Owen, I perceive you to be a white man, and I hate white people, so you're fired. But if I hated white people and I wanted to fire Owen, I could just be like, you're fired for no reason, right? And so I have worked with some workplaces where someone was dumb enough to actually say, hey, we're discriminating against you because of your mental health status. And we were able to kind of fight for those folks in that. And very often it's much more subtle than that, which then leads back into lots of interesting questions where I'm trying to destigmatize folks, and then folks are saying, should I disclose to my boss that I have mental illness? Should I disclose on a job interview? Should I disclose once I'm hired? What should that look like? And talking through that and trying to be both helping this person to do what is most effective, what's going to work for them, and also not being sort of an agent of further stigma. Like I don't want ever someone to be like, yeah, I was really feeling okay with my identity as someone living with mental illness, but then I talked to Doug and now I'm not. That's not sort of what I'm going for in my life. And so we talk through what those things can look like. As a quick aside, what I recommend generally is, because you don't know where someone's coming from and you don't know what stigma they may be carrying, and you also often won't be given any recourse, is generally I tell people don't disclose until after you are hired, and then only disclose like to an HR if you're asking for an accommodation. And I will kind of, as part of that, have a long conversation about like, you and I know you're ready for this job. It would be against my professional ethics to send you towards this job if we didn't think you're ready. You and I have done a lot of work to get there. We know you can do it. So as we're talking about this, we are only talking about the irrational stigma someone else may hold. And someone in power of you may hold an irrational stigma. So we need you to be ready for that and be thoughtful about that as you move. Another one that comes up a lot is gaps in the resume. Generally, Skyland Trail starts out residential and then eventually we'll step folks down. But generally through that process, it's at least 3 months. It can be more or less, but the kind of average length of stay in our program is 3 months, and it's really not conducive to having a job. Family medical leave often is about that length, so like sometimes folks are on leave, it kind of lines up nicely, but most folks who I'm working with are currently unemployed at the time that I'm working with them. So if nothing else, they have that gap on their resume, and oftentimes will have had lots of other gaps on their resume. Again, someone who has an untreated illness and a difficult boss, very often you'll like look back at their resume and they will have lots of very short kind of short tenures at different jobs. And when you get into the stories with them, like I very often am like, yeah, I would have supported your choice to leave under those circumstances too. And so it's not about judging them, but it is about acknowledging that when an employer sees that on a resume, there may be some challenges. And so some of what we'll talk about with our clients is how to present that on a resume, or if they get the question on a job interview, how to go about it. And what I generally encourage folks to do, and I'm sort of tossing this out because in case this is relevant for any of you or folks that you're here at One Life to support, I think it's a good thing to know. And obviously there's lots of reasons to have gaps in your resume that aren't directly tied to mental health as well. It's something that I think a lot of us navigate. What I generally tell folks to do in that situation is just to say, I was dealing with a medical issue, it's been resolved, I'm excited to get back to work. And we'll talk about how to present that in the specific job interview that we're prepping for. But the idea there is that by law, they really can't ask you on an interview about your personal health, and so you're kind of doing a gentle stiff arm with that, where you're saying, hey, I'm giving you this information, I'm telling you it's resolved, and you can't ask me any more questions about it, right? And the reality is some employers may fill in the blank with all sorts of things, but then when they start to do that, there's so many blanks that they could fill in there. And I think in an interview that's otherwise gone well, I don't think that's gonna be an issue for employers, and I've seen that worked out. I've had a lot of people go in interviews with that strategy and not even get asked about the gaps, and then the ones that do, I've seen a lot of them get hired. So that's kind of the direction that I encourage folks to go. So that's sort of, again, an example of how the sort of internal experience of mental health intersects with the sort of external stigma that sometimes exists in this environment where the available jobs have sort of shrunk and the opportunity to find something that is a really good fit has sort of also shrunk. Any questions about that so far?
It's like that.
Yeah.
What's like the average time that you're working with a client, through this process?
Yeah, it depends is the most honest answer, but most of our clients usually will start with us about halfway through their treatment at Skyland. So it's usually about a month and a half that we get with them in an average, a rough average of 3 months stay. Some folks really hit the ground running. Just 2 weeks ago, I met with someone for their initial assessment. It was their first day at Skyland, and they said, honestly, I'm glad to talk to you because most of the reason I'm here is this. Like, I was maybe a little more sad than other people for a long time, but until I was in my last job, I was really kind of doing okay. Like, life was okay. That last job wrecked me, and also I have to have an next job, and I don't know what that's gonna be like. So she kind of was like, let's get plugged in, let's start right away. More commonly, folks come in and deal with kind of some other stuff and then kind of circle back to us. We also offer an outpatient segment of our program where after folks graduate from our overall program, they can keep working with us if they need that. And if you are someone here who is living with mental illness and would like some more formalized career counseling, you could do worse than to check out Skyland Trail's website. This is sort of a shameless plug, but I don't get paid any extra whether you sign up or not, so I think it's a good service. And we do offer that to folks who have never been at Skyland Trail. So we actually right now have a client in our outpatient program who I'm the only staff member at Skyland he's ever worked with. And so that is something that we offer. And I would encourage you too, if you have someone in your life who's living with mental illness and needs that support, consider having them give Skyland Trail a call. Because what we do is sort of the career counseling that kind of anybody can benefit from, combined with an awareness of how mental health shows up in Any other questions? Okay. So, to come back to a core thing to give y'all something that you can walk out with, what I would encourage you to do, if you are in this place of feeling stuck, of looking at job description after job description after job description on Indeed, saying that you need more experience. By the way, with that, if you have all the requirements but one, especially if the one is like the years of experience, go ahead and apply. It was very much not science, but someone I follow on Twitter, which is X now, I guess, which is weird, a while ago did a poll where they're like trying to see something, and they asked that, they're like, if you meet all the requirements except for one, do you still apply? And the comments were full of kind of women-identified people saying, no, why would I waste my time in theirs? And men being like, hell yeah, I'm gonna apply, right? So channel the overconfident white man inside of you and apply for that job, right? And you'll be surprised what you may get. And I can say that because my job at Skyland Trail when I came there required a master's degree, and I hadn't even begun my master's program yet. I now have finished it, but and more on that, on my personal story a little bit later. But that is one thing there. So if you're running into just that, just apply. But if you're in that place and you're just kind of struggling with all we've talked about tonight, I want to give you 2 or 3 things to think about. One of them that hits the sort of gladness question in our Frederick Buechner quote, one that hits the hunger question, and I think one that kind of intersects with both. So for gladness, one of the best things you can do for yourself is to clarify what your interests are. There's a lot of ways you can do that. What I think most of us do is, historically what a lot of us have done is just find jobs and then just kind of go from a job we hate to a job we hate less to a job we eventually love. And that you can do, that's what I did. It's a really slow and inefficient process. There are some other things you can do. One is asking your community what you're good at. You might be surprised sometimes at what the people around you might name that you might not have thought of. Another thing that's just a very logistical thing is do an interest profiler. There's a couple ones. There's one called the Strong Interest Inventory that we use at Skyland Trail. You have to find like a licensed person to give that to you. But if you want to do one for free, you can go to onetonline.org, which is a really useful website. We use it a lot in our work. Again, it's ONET, like O for occupation, so onetonline.org, and look for their interest profiler. It asks you a bunch of questions about what you like doing, about what you don't like doing, and then it kind of spits out some jobs that you would be likely to enjoy. And I think that's really important because for most of us, there's a lot of jobs we could do. And there's a relatively smaller number of jobs that we could do and enjoy doing, right? And I think that's a really important thing to know. So if you're gonna go do one of those, it's really important to go with your gut. It's really easy to overthink those and start saying, oh, this job that's asking me about sounds like it would be awesome, but I know it wouldn't pay enough, so I'll say, no, I'm not gonna do that. Or it sounds great, but I'd have to go back to school forever, and I'm done with school, I'm not gonna do it, stuff like that. Try not to think that way as you take it. Just go with your gut, find your inner toddler, let them have a tantrum. And what you'll do is you'll get a better list of jobs that you're expected to like, and you might be surprised what kinds of things show up in there. The first time I did one of those was actually my first week at Skyland Trail, and I was really just doing it because I was going to be administering it to other folks and I had to learn how it went. And it was very eerie. One of the things that it does is it gives you a top 10 list of jobs where it says, it gives you a really long list to look at, but it says, here's the 10 to consider first. And one of those things was career counselor. I had really pivoted to that job. I was working in child welfare. I was working in foster care, and it was draining my soul. It was getting rough. It really hit the compassion fatigue burnout place, and I just was willing to just do any job other than that. And so I came to this job, and it was just so funny to me as I was sitting there kind of burned out from my previous job at this new job, doing this thing and going, man, I wonder what life could have been if I had realized sooner that maybe career counseling is something I could be good at and enjoy and look into. It was very validating to have that. But what was interesting too is on that list, several other jobs that I had were also popping up. So working in child welfare was there. Clergy was there, which again, I had given a go. The only one that didn't make sense was lawyer, and I was telling my dad about it, and he said, your mom and I thought for sure you were gonna be a lawyer. The way he said you came out of the womb arguing with us, we knew that's what you were gonna do. And so that's part of why I say do an interest profiler, but that's also part of why I say check in with your community. The people around you who know you may have ideas about where you'd succeed that you haven't thought of yet. So again, trying to get a sense of what it is that is going to make you glad. And then when we think about the hunger that is there in the world, so again, going back to the Beatner quote of the place where you need to be is where your gladness and the world's hunger meet. One of the best ways you can get connected with that is to connect with other humans. So I love that you're all here, like you're already halfway there at least. And I realize that what I'm saying now is sort of another word that means network. And if you're like me, whenever you heard about networking growing up, it always kind of felt gross because it's like I'm supposed to make friends, but for the purpose of getting jobs, it feels dishonest, it feels gross. But it really is one of the most effective things you can do. And particularly if you're dealing with mental illness, it is one of the things you're least likely to do. Because one of the things that most stripes of mental illness tend to have with them is a sense of globalizing, right? So very often someone who is in the throes of major depressive disorder is not going, I am sad about this one little part of the world. They're going, it is all sad, right? And they're not going, I have been blocked out of this one little opportunity. They're like, I have been blocked out of everything. I can't tell you how common it is that I talk with someone earlier on in their treatment and I say, who do you know? Like you've been in the field for a while, who do you know out there? They'll say, no one, I have no friends, no one would stick up for me, no one would put a word in for me. And I go, okay, and we kind of keep meeting and we tidy up the resume and we do all the logistical stuff and then the meds start working and they feel a little brighter and they reach out to a friend and then they have a job, right? And so I'm not saying that it's always that easy, it often isn't. And reaching out into your networks is important. Every single one of you is the kind of person who would show up at 6 p.m. on a Sunday night to an initiative designed to support people who are at the margins. And I promise you, if you are that type of person, there are some people in your life who feel like they owe you one. There are people who have had a good experience of you, who would be willing to do you a solid, and it is worth keeping your eyes open and reaching out to them. As you age, more and more of those people will even have jobs. When you're all in your 20s, like a lot of you are just like, hey, we're here for each other and all of us are unemployed, but that will get better. And so kind of reach out. The other thing with that, and I'm sorry, use nepotism, right? You are competing with people whose daddies are getting them jobs. If your dad can get you a job, take the job, okay? And I'm sorry, it's not fun, it's not sexy. You will not keep your job because of who your dad, uncle, mom, friend is, but getting a job that way can be what you need to do. So just swallow it, humble yourself, take the job if that is what you need to do. And if that's not somewhere you want to be, then plan your exit. Get the job, get the experience, build up the network, make those contacts, and plan your exit. And if that still feels a little too cynical, I think a different way to think about it is build your community rather than network so you can get jobs, make friends with people for money. Build your community by looking for and doing good in the world. And again, I have a lot of confidence in anyone who's in this room that you can do that because you're here. Look for ways to help other people. Be that person who does a solid for someone else, right? And don't be stingy when you get the chance to do that for someone. It will pay off. As I mentioned, I did about a year at Candler School of Theology. I was planning to do this every Sunday night of my life for the rest of my life. I was planning to just talk to people in churches. And I had a crisis of faith and I dropped out and went back to social work. And somewhere along the way, when I was working at Candler, I connected with a guy named Matt Collins, who was my supervisor at my contextual education placement. He eventually left that job and went to a place called Skyland Trail that I had never heard of. I'm from Georgia. Skyland's been in Georgia a few years longer than I've been alive, and never heard of it. He went and got a job there about a year later, he called me and said, hey, we're hiring, I think you should apply, right? Didn't have a graduate degree. He said, I'll figure it out. And they hired me. And he came in, and this is a lot of information, but he offered me the job. He called me to say, hey, you did a good job on the interview. We want to offer you the job. And he named a number and said, is that acceptable to you? And at that point, again, coming from child welfare, I was sober now, I would have taken anything. I said yes. And he said, so what I'm hearing is you counted with 7,000 higher than I did, and we settled on 5,000 higher than what I just offered. Is that correct? I was like, sure. He said, okay, done, right? He did me a solid. No one in Skyland knows that, so strike that from the video. It's too late now. But he did me a solid. And so a couple years later, he left the organization. I had been promoted up into his role, and we were hiring for my old role. And I wasn't quite so sneaky, but I went and sat with HR and said, here's what I think this role needs, and I think we need to pay this person this. So we hired someone in who was a bunch younger than me and was making even more than I was when I started. And I'm saying all that to say, I started feeling some kind of way about it. Even though I was the one who had done it, I was the one who had advocated for us to pay this person a little bit more than I was making when I started. I felt some kind of way. I felt kind of like, well, I did that same job, I didn't get paid that. And I started to be like, okay, this is how that happens. It is easy to get in that mindset of I struggled so other people should struggle, right? Or I didn't have this so other people shouldn't have it. And I want to tell you, to the best of your ability, fight that impulse, right? Like, I struggled, so if I can make something a little better for someone else, I will, right? If you do that, you will go through this life with a powerful network that will come out to support you. So for the rest of his life, if Matthew calls me and needs help with work, I answer the phone, right? And I like to think that that employee that I hired and started and hired, I like to think that if I needed something, and she's one of those people who's gonna be like all of our boss someday. I think if I needed something, I think she'd be there for me. And so that's kind of what I mean. And it's not that I was like, oh, I'm gonna make friends with Matthew for a job connection. It was just, we worked together doing what we were both doing at the time that we were in seminary. And he remembered that and chose to do something good for me. And then I did that for someone else, right? And that's what I mean when I say network. And that's also what I mean when I say fight that impulse to be like, people should struggle as I struggle. And last but not least, I will land the plane here. I have no idea how long I'm supposed to go, so I hope I'm not well over it and you're all like, okay, Doug. I'm gonna land the plane here. Recalibrate your definition of right. So often, I think that because we feel it's so important, and we feel that like, we need to find that place where we're glad, we need to find that place where we're contributing as we were meant to, we kind of think that until we're in that place, we're messing things up, we're failing, we're doing it wrong, you know. I hear often from folks that I work with that like, I'm worthless, I have nothing to offer this world, I'm doing nothing, you know, all sorts of those stories. And I think that we're wrong when we think that way. I think that a big part of, I think it was Aristotle who talked about how being good wasn't just about doing good things, but it was about working hard to understand what it is to do good things. And I think that there's an element of that here, that even the pursuit of what it is that we need to be doing is itself doing right for that point. And so when I think back to my 20s, I think about bouncing around from jobs that I thought would help the world and I thought I'd be kind of good at. And I think about like a lot of turmoil and strife. But eventually, accidentally, kind of through one of those, I made that connection with Matt that led into this. And then when I got there, I was able to be like, oh, okay, I've tried this, it didn't go well, I tried that, I tried all these different things. Now I'm doing career counseling and oh yeah, it turns out I kind of like that. It turns out that's kind of working for me. And so I wish it were different. I wish it were the way that my dad swears it used to be, which is that like you kind of figure out what you like and then you just say, I'd like to do that. And the world's like, we'll pay you, right? I wish it was that way. It's kind of not, but I think that it's important to know that like you are doing right, you are doing good in this world when you are looking for that place. I think that looking for that place is itself a healthy thing and even a holy thing. At a practical level, another part of that is that if you are actively looking for that, you're unlikely to miss it when it comes along. Again, part of my success at Skyland Trail was that by the time I got there to my early 30s and started doing this job, I knew enough about myself, again, through lots of trial and error, I knew enough about myself to know, oh, I'm doing well, like I'm good at this, and oh, I kind of enjoy it. It was really a revelation to me that like my shoulders don't actually hurt every Sunday night. That was the stress from the previous job as I would like start doing this because I was getting ready to go back to work. And to be like, wow, I remember after my first vacation, I came back like, you know, kind of sad to be leaving the beach, but kind of like ready to come back to work. I was kind of like excited to do what I had to do. There was important stuff to do there, and that's what I want for all of you, and really for everyone. But the only way I was able to kind of recognize all that and notice all that was because of that trial and error. So if you are banging your head against the wall in your trial, and especially if you're like me and you have like a really functional sibling that your family's like really into, you know, like it's super cool. You know, and you're like comparing yourself to other people and you're banging your head against the wall. If you are looking for that place, if you are looking for that place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet, I think you're doing good, especially in your 20s. I think that's okay. I think that's even good. And last but not least, as I've said a couple times, this space is a good place to do that. You know, there's no reason that the network can't happen here. There's no reason that the group of people you look to do good for and do well with can't happen here. And so as someone who is a mental health professional in Atlanta and who loves my job, but is also really connected to how much of society has fallen apart before people get to me, thank you. Thank you, because I think all of you are in some way or another, just by being here, you are doing at least some part of that. And it's something that is making the world better, because I will tell you, I can't tell you how many people come to Skyland Trail kind of on their last leg. I mean, so often when I ask people, what do you want to do when you leave treatment? They say, man, I'm still deciding if I'm going to be alive in 3 months. You know, that's where I'm at right now. That's where I'm figuring out. And I'm so aware of how often social bonds have broken down around them. And I'll say, okay, who in your life is supportive of you? And I'll hear my mom sometimes, or no one, you know. But when I hear friends, I very often, like, some part of me brightens up because I'm like, okay, there's people in this person's corner who are gonna fight for him. And so thank you for being that. Thank you for being this space and these people that are looking to figure these issues out and support folks. I would love it. As much as I love my job, I'm also really good at finding stuff to do for work. I'll find something else, like put me out of a job, please. So thank you. With that, questions?
Will you speak a little bit to kind of how you help people maintain gladness and like the centeredness and things like that as they ramp up in a new job? Because I think that for me and maybe for other people as well, that it comes with the intensity, the anxiety comes with the intensity that
Yeah.
comes when I really do like my job, but that means that it claims a lot of life and a lot of space. And so I think how can you will help me encourage too.
Absolutely, that's a great question, thank you. So some of that gets kind of specific to a specific situation, but I think one of the things that is common throughout is first starting with a sense of normalization, like just talking about like, what is it that starting a new job is like? And so talking about how, yes, our goal is that you have work-life balance, and that involves being willing to set boundaries at work, and also being successful at a job really involves hitting the ground running and showing, hey, I want to be here and I want to do well, right? And so how do you kind of balance that? And sometimes that comes down to knowing people. Like if I know this client has and usually by the time they're going back to work, I do. You know, that's usually kind of after some work together. If they tend to be someone who is a little bit more passive, I'll say, hey, you know, I definitely want that balance for you. Right now is a great time to really hit it hard, you know, really just kind of knock it out the park. If they tend to be someone who kind of overworks, I'll be like, hey, let's be careful about like setting up a narrative that you're the person who will always stay late every time and doesn't have a life, right? And so that's not very specific, I guess, to your question, but I think it kind of lands differently for different patients. But I think a big part of it is just normalizing that like it's gonna be a little rough usually in the beginning. Actually, I had lunch with a friend of mine who is in a new job this afternoon. And so she's like freaking out, I think I'm failing and everything and all that. And I was saying, okay, well, I know her supervisor, which helps. And so I was like, I know your supervisor, they're gonna tell you the truth. And so that's part of it too, is like, what is the environment around you? So like, as you're in this new job and you're liking it, who in the environment do you feel like you can trust? Like, or what aspects of the environment do you feel like are there for you so that you can use that to sort of evaluate how you're doing? And if someone is the kind of person who's constantly scanning, you mentioned anxiety, like if they're constantly scanning for something to be wrong, which as someone who has anxiety, I'm like, yeah, I'm familiar with that. How can they kind of relax that a little bit while keeping the standard high? And so very often it looks like, well, what feedback are you getting from your job? And then if they're going, yeah, my boss said good job today, but I think what he really meant was I'm failing. I'll be like, well, I get that feeling. However, that's probably not what was happening. And I'll bring in, because I'm a manager, I'll bring also my experience of supervising people in, or I'll say like, I'm trying to be a nice guy, I'm trying to be good to people, but like, if someone's messing up, I'm not gonna tell them they did a great job. Like, I'm just not gonna do that, I'm just shooting myself in the foot. So, I don't know how specific that was to it, but I think to summarize, what's important is just to know what that new job space is like, and to not sort of, again, not internalize the sense that if this is hard, it's because I'm failing at it, but to be like, it is hard, and adjusted for how that particular person is wired, how can you get through it, and then kind of go. And sometimes too, it is reminding people they have options. I can't tell you how many times someone has come into my office. I'm gonna sound really manipulative here, but it's for good, y'all. But I can't tell you how many times someone has come into my office being like, this job is too hard, I'm gonna quit. And I'll be like, yeah, you should. And they'll be like, well, all right. And so like, sometimes being like, well, just give me the reasons. What are the reasons for and against? And just reminding them that, and I probably wouldn't be like, yeah, you should, but like, you could, you know? And like, just being like, you have that option, you could leave. So if you're not taking that, then what is keeping you here? And is that something that you're comfortable with? And last but not least, I'm kind of circling the runway here, but one of the things that I will do when I get to work with people before they go back to a job is say, decide ahead of time what your non-negotiables are and write them down and put a thing in your calendar where Siri will yell at you to check in. And ideally talk them over. If you have that good friend, talk them over with a friend and just kind of go, okay, 6 months in, here's what I said I wouldn't do or wouldn't do in terms of work-life balance. Here's what I said I would and wouldn't do in terms of office politics and whatever. How am I doing with that? And how is this job either fitting with those goals or not fitting with them?
Thank you.
Hope something in that was helpful. Other questions? Okay.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Well, that was better than I could have expected with how little direction I gave. So on that note, I think we will be sending out a survey after this. What would you look for in future events? Trying to just get a gauge of like what is helpful for everyone. Again, that was fantastic. So really appreciate it. On Instagram, we are at 2020 Vision Wellness. The first word is spelled out, then 20 the digit, Vision Wellness. So follow us on there for updates for future events. But yeah, lastly, just put a hand together for Doug. Thank you so much. Yeah, we're all set, so feel free to stick around, mingle a little bit, but that's it for the program. Thanks, guys.